You know those rare moments when life seems to align just right after years of navigating the usual ups and downs, offering a glimpse of the stability and joy you've been working toward without much fanfare, and in my case, that moment arrived as I stepped into the community hall in Oak Park on that balmy June evening. My arm comfortably linked with Mark's, while we both felt the subtle thrill of being dressed up for what was meant to be our straightforward celebration of getting engaged after all the detours that had marked my path up to that point at 38 years old. I'd invested weeks into orchestrating every detail of the party with the kind of practical enthusiasm that comes from someone who's learned to make things happen through sheer determination rather than relying on luck. From the string lights that softly illuminated the wooden beams overhead to the carefully curated playlist featuring those indie folk songs that had soundtracked our early dates back in college, and don't forget the barbecue spread complete with ribs that I'd overseen being slow-cooked to achieve that perfect sticky, smoky tenderness Mark always craved, evoking memories of those endless Midwest summers spent in backyards, much like the one we hoped to call our own someday soon. Mark gave my hand a reassuring squeeze as we moved through the crowd of familiar faces, his warm, easy smile drawing people in the way it always did because he possessed that grounded, reliable presence that made others feel at ease. The sort of man who spent his weekends coaching Little League baseball for the neighborhood kids even though we didn't have any of our own yet, and who never forgot an anniversary without needing some digital nudge to remind him. Our friends from the surrounding blocks had turned out in force, the ones we'd forged bonds with over shared block parties and casual chats about school runs or home improvements. And my parents lingered close by with Dad launching into his classic dad jokes about finally welcoming a son-in-law who could tackle the stubborn garage door without dialing up a professional repair service, all of which contributed to the atmosphere of uncomplicated happiness that wrapped around us like a comfortable old blanket. Even Lauren, my younger sister who trailed me by 3 years and had a knack for inserting herself into situations with her larger-than-life energy, made an appearance, arriving fashionably late, as was her custom. Clutching her designer purse and radiating that polished glow she cultivated so effortlessly, the kind that often overshadowed whatever else was happening in the room without her even trying too hard. The evening progressed with a smooth, unhurried rhythm that made everything feel just right, filled with laughter and light conversation until the moment arrived for the toasts. When I rose to my feet with my heart beating in that exhilarating way that signals something truly meaningful is unfolding. Lifting my glass toward Mark as I spoke about the serendipitous way we'd crossed paths 5 years earlier at a mundane networking event in the city, how his understated humor had gradually drawn me out of the emotional fog following my previous divorce, and how I looked forward with genuine anticipation to constructing a shared life together in our modest fixer-upper house on the outskirts of Chicago, a place that represented the steady future we both deserved after navigating our individual challenges. The room fell into an attentive hush, all eyes focused on us in a way that made me feel genuinely centered and valued for the first time in ages, without any need for excuses or qualifications, a sensation that carried the promise of finally emerging from the patterns that had defined so much of my earlier experiences. Then, without warning, Lauren pushed back her chair with a scrape that cut through the quiet like an unwelcome interruption, standing up unbidden and shifting the entire dynamic in an instant, her presence commanding attention as it so often did through no accident of her own making. She began her interjection with that smooth, engaging tone she reserved for gatherings where she wanted to hold court, acknowledging my organizational skills in a way that sounded complimentary on the surface, but carried an undercurrent of condescension, before pivoting dramatically to declare that while Emily had always excelled at planning, certain family developments simply couldn't be postponed for anyone else's milestone, her hand drifting almost theatrically to rest on her abdomen as she announced with a beaming smile that she was expecting a baby due sometime in the spring, a revelation she claimed she could no longer keep to herself amid the celebratory mood. The announcement landed with a weight that altered the evening's trajectory before anyone could fully absorb it, and to drive the point home, she added with her trademark smirk, the one that had been a fixture of our sibling interactions since childhood. often laced with a competitive edge that she supposed this meant she'd manage to steal the spotlight once more, prompting an immediate wave of laughter that started as polite ripples from our mutual acquaintances and built into fuller, more enthusiastic responses from my parents, who immediately enveloped her in hugs as if her news eclipsed every other achievement in the vicinity. Mark let out a chuckle too, a soft, obligatory sound that resonated more painfully than it ought to have in that moment, while the assembled guests broke into applause, their toasts swiftly redirecting toward Lauren's supposed miracle and speculations about nursery setups, leaving my carefully prepared words to dissolve into the background amid forced nods and redirected chatter. I remained standing there with my glass, still poised midway to my mouth, a flush of heat creeping up my neck as the discussions pivoted entirely to topics like potential baby names and the logistics of welcoming a new family member. My engagement ring suddenly seeming like an incidental accessory in a narrative that no longer revolved around me or the life Mark and I were building together. This wasn't an isolated incident in our history. During our high school years, for instance, she'd chosen the precise moment of my college acceptance announcement to reveal her own unexpectedly strong report card, effectively sidelining my accomplishment into mere afterthought, but this instance struck deeper because it intruded directly on the foundation of my personal happiness, timed with such precision that it felt less like coincidence and more like a deliberate maneuver to reclaim the central role she seemed to crave perpetually. The laughter continued to echo around the space, with toasts raised to her radiant future while my parents fussed over her with the kind of doting energy they rarely extended to my quieter milestones, and even Mark's apologetic sidelong glance couldn't fully mask the subtle unease in his expression, as if he were already calculating the long-term implications of such entrenched family dynamics on our plans. As the party gradually wound toward its conclusion with guests beginning to filter out into the cooling night air, exchanging hugs and vague commitments to respond to invitations in due time, I maintained a facade of gracious smiles and engaging small talk despite the churning frustration building within me, determined not to let the evening's pivot define the night entirely. Lauren approached me near the dessert table, selecting a chocolate-dipped strawberry with an air of casual nonchalance that belied the tension between us, and offered what passed for consolation in her worldview by suggesting that I should relax, because the party hadn't truly been derailed and that pregnancies simply carried more immediate excitement than engagements in the current cultural landscape. Her delivery carried that familiar veneer of insincere empathy, reminiscent of past occasions when she'd borrowed items like my prom dress only to return them damaged while evading accountability, or when she'd commandeered family attention during vacations by fabricating crises to position herself as the victim deserving of sympathy. Rather than erupting in confrontation, I lifted my glass in a gesture that masqueraded as a toast, but emerged with an edge honed by accumulated resentments, wishing her well in her ongoing quest to dominate every occasion with her latest development, and hoping that her penchant for dramatic reveals would persist without ever fully acknowledging the collateral shadows it cast on those around her. She hesitated for a split second, her laughter catching slightly as nearby attendees misinterpreted the exchange as affectionate sibling ribbing, but the moment passed, leaving a faint crack in her usual composure. By the time Mark and I arrived back at our home, sinking into the familiar contours of our well-worn leather couch amid containers of leftover party food that now tasted like hollow victory, the full impact of the evening settled over me with the heaviness of unresolved Midwest humidity clinging to the air after a summer storm. He draped an arm around my shoulders in a gesture of solidarity, commenting on how Lauren's behavior aligned with patterns he'd observed before, yet his tone betrayed a trace of reluctance, as though he were mentally auditing the potential costs of perpetual involvement in such familial entanglements. I murmured agreement while fixating on my phone as it vibrated with incoming notifications, images from the event circulating online with captions emphasizing Lauren's surprise revelation, while my engagement merited only passing mentions in the comments sections. In that quiet aftermath, an idea crystallized from the depths of long-suppressed irritations, suggesting that we refuse to concede the narrative so easily. leading us to conceptualize a save-the-date announcement during our morning coffee ritual that would assert our story with unyielding clarity and perhaps even incorporate a subtle reclamation of the attention she'd commandeered. However, as I composed the initial outline and forwarded it to a designer acquaintance for refinement, another message arrived from my mother inquiring about Lauren's evident distress and proposing a conversation to smooth things over. A development that hinted at the complications yet to unfold. Unbeknownst to me then, the real undercurrent revealed itself later that same night when Mark excused himself to the porch for what he described as a quick call. His voice carrying softly through the screen door as he reassured Lauren with phrases like understanding her perspective and attributing my reactions to temporary stress, a discovery that sent a chill through me and ignited questions about loyalties that I hadn't anticipated confronting so soon. Emerging from the haze of a restless night where sleep had come in fits interrupted by replays of Lauren's smirk and the echoing laughter that had swallowed my moment, I found myself gazing at the bedroom ceiling as the morning light filtered through the blinds in soft, unrelenting stripes, the overhead fan rotating with a lazy whir that seemed to mirror the disorientation churning inside me after the emotional whiplash of the previous evening's events at the community hall. Mark had already risen and moved about the kitchen downstairs, the comforting aroma of pancakes sizzling on the griddle drifting upward like a gentle invitation to reclaim some normalcy. A ritual he often turned to in the aftermath of difficult situations stemming from his upbringing in a large Irish-American family, where hearty breakfasts served as the universal balm for everything from sports defeats to the more tangled heartaches of adolescence. Joining him at the island counter, I settled onto a stool with my movements still heavy from the unresolved tension, and without much preamble, we transitioned into discussing our strategy for responding to the hijacking of our celebration. The conversation unfolding amid the clatter of utensils and the faint scratch of a notepad where we jotted ideas for that save-the-date card, envisioning it as a bold assertion of our partnership that would feature a candid photograph of us at the lake house where Mark had proposed under a canopy of autumn leaves, complete with phrasing that evoked fresh starts and enduring commitments without veering into overt confrontation. Yet the fragile sense of momentum we were building shattered almost immediately when my phone began buzzing incessantly on the countertop, pulling me into a barrage of messages from the sprawling family group chat that mixed belated congratulations on our engagement with an overwhelming tide of justifications for Lauren's behavior, as if she embodied some vulnerable figure in need of collective protection rather than the instigator of the disruption. My father contributed a message expressing pride in both of his daughters while cautioning against allowing a minor overlap in timings to overshadow the underlying happiness that should bind us all together. Whereas my mother followed with a cascade of affectionate emojis paired with a note about how Lauren's fluctuating hormones were undoubtedly amplifying her emotions and urging me to extend a measure of understanding in light of such circumstances. The notion of extending grace struck me as particularly galling given the calculated timing of her revelation that had transformed my carefully orchestrated evening into an unintended sideshow, and as I scrolled further through the thread, my jaw clenched upon encountering a shared photograph capturing Lauren in a triumphant pose beside the event's centerpiece cake, accompanied by a caption proclaiming double celebrations in a way that rendered my own milestone into little more than an incidental backdrop to her narrative. Sensing the tension coiling in my posture as I gripped the coffee mug until my knuckles paled, Mark proposed that we escape the confines of the house for a drive to gain some perspective, which led us to the serene paths along the Des Plaines River in a nearby park where the water flowed steadily past banks lined with oaks beginning to hint at their golden fall transformation, a spot we frequented whenever the pressures of our professional lives demanded a reset through simple conversation and fresh air. As we walked side by side along the gravel trail, the rhythm of our steps syncing with the gentle lap of the river against the shore, I finally gave voice to the deeper reservoir of frustrations that had accumulated over years of navigating Lauren's unyielding pattern of positioning herself as the vibrant, attention-grabbing force within our family dynamic, recounting instances from our teenage years, such as the time she had deliberately spilled grape juice across my meticulously Prepared valedictorian speech notes mere hours before the graduation ceremony, only to dissolve into tears before our mother and redirect the ensuing sympathy toward her own fabricated anxieties over mediocre academic performance. Similarly, during our college years, she had appeared unannounced at my dormitory with a dramatic display of heartbreak over an alleged breakup, leveraging my support as an unwitting cover for her infidelity that she later confessed in passing. All of which illustrated a consistent strategy of commandeering emotional resources and spotlight to compensate for whatever insecurities drove her competitive nature. Mark absorbed the details with thoughtful nods, his expression reflecting a blend of empathy and the subtle reservations that had begun to surface the night before, as though he were internally assessing whether this entrenched sibling rivalry represented a temporary flare-up or a perpetual undercurrent that might complicate the life we envisioned building together in the years ahead. He eventually responded by affirming his commitment to me as the partner he had consciously selected amid life's complexities, suggesting that we channel our energy into crafting a save-the-date that would stand as a testament to our shared journey. And so we paused on a weathered wooden bench overlooking the water, refining the design with elegant cardstock in mind, our names prominently displayed alongside the wedding date encircled like a vow, and a carefully worded line about embracing our story without interruptions that served as a veiled reference comprehensible only to those familiar with the recent context. By the time we returned home in the early afternoon, a tentative spark of empowerment had ignited from our collaborative planning, though the persistent notifications on my device tempered the optimism, including a direct text from Lauren brimming with superficial cheerfulness through a string of emojis that thinly disguised her pointed remark about hoping our upcoming plans wouldn't inadvertently eclipse her own developing situation in any unintended manner. That same evening, under the pretense of an impromptu family dinner orchestrated by my mother, who framed it as an opportunity to restore harmony, Mark and I made our way to my parents' modest ranch-style home where the dining room table awaited laden with steaming trays of her signature lasagna layered with ricotta and ground beef alongside baskets of garlic bread, still warm from the oven, the savory scents mingling in the air to create an illusion of cozy reconciliation that masked the brewing undercurrents of discord. My father occupied his customary recliner in the adjacent living room, temporarily silencing the rerun of a classic Cubs game on the television to greet us with his usual gruff affection. But the atmosphere shifted as my mother fussed over the arrangements, strategically seating Lauren at the head of the table in a manner that elevated her status akin to that of an honored visitor, despite her role as the source of the recent upheaval. She entered the scene with characteristic flair, her ensemble chosen to accentuate what she presented as the early swell of her pregnancy even at just 3 months along, which appeared more aspirational than evident, launching into animated descriptions of prenatal appointments and peculiar cravings for combinations like pickles paired with ice cream that elicited delighted exclamations from our parents, as though her disclosure single-handedly promised the continuation of our lineage in the most joyful possible way. The meal commenced with a veneer of civility, punctuated by the scrape of forks against plates and desultory exchanges about daily routines, such as my recounting of a challenging client presentation at the marketing firm or Mark's anecdote from the construction site involving a humorous mishap with faulty scaffolding, but Lauren deftly redirected the dialogue toward her experiences at every opportunity, elaborating on vivid dreams involving ultrasounds and emphasizing how the child would inherit her adventurous disposition in ways that painted her as the epicenter of transformative energy. I experienced that familiar internal burn intensifying with each anecdote, a sensation rooted in decades of similar encroachments. And when she inquired about our wedding preparations with an expression that blended curiosity and faint condescension, as if our efforts constituted a secondary endeavor, I responded by highlighting the seamless progress we were making, underscoring that this time around, the focus remained squarely on the couple without any diversions from external developments. The declaration hung in the air, prompting a momentary silence broken only by my mother's pointed glance of disapproval and my father's awkward chuckle, while Lauren's features tightened ever so slightly in a reaction that betrayed her discomfort at the implied boundary. Following the main course, as Mark volunteered to assist with clearing the dishes in a bid to diffuse the mounting strain, I excused myself to the upstairs attic where my mother stored an assortment of keepsakes in dusty cardboard boxes, ostensibly seeking a moment of solitude, but driven by a compulsion to unearth something tangible that might validate my perspective on the long-standing dynamics at play. Sifting through faded photo albums and miscellaneous mementos that chronicled our family's history from childhood vacations to holiday gatherings, my fingers encountered a sealed envelope wedged within the pages of an old high school yearbook, bearing Lauren's distinctive looping script addressed to me from a period long past, and upon opening it, I discovered a candid letter she had penned, but evidently never delivered, pouring out raw admissions of envy toward the perceived ease of my achievements and outlining her deliberate intentions to undermine any success that threatened to outshine her own position within the family hierarchy. The contents sent my pulse racing with a mix of validation and trepidation, recognizing this artifact as a potential key to unraveling her motivations. Yet just as I absorbed the implications, my phone vibrated insistently in my pocket, displaying Lauren's name on the screen. Answering with a composed demeanor despite the adrenaline surging through me, I heard her demand an apology for what she characterized as my undermining toast from the party, to which I replied with measured calm, suggesting that apologies might be in order on multiple fronts and alluding cryptically to the impending arrival of our save-the-date materials that carried an element of surprise tailored for the entire family's consideration. Her response faltered into stunned silence, followed by a burst of indignation querying the meaning behind my words, but I ended the call with a quiet resolve blooming within, only to descend the stairs moments later and overhear my mother confiding to my father in hushed tones about her concerns over my evolving demeanor and the worrisome emergence of what she perceived as a vengeful streak that could fracture our bonds irreparably. An observation that forced me to confront whether my actions were indeed altering the core of who I had always strived to be in ways that might prove irreversible. With the discovery of that attic letter still fresh in my mind like a half-remembered dream that carried the weight of long-buried truths, the ensuing weeks slipped by in a whirlwind of demanding work obligations and the meticulous coordination of wedding-related vendors. From florists discussing seasonal blooms to caterers outlining menu options that aligned with our vision of a heartfelt yet understated affair, all while the document remained concealed in my desk drawer at home as a silent talisman of potential leverage that I pondered deploying without fully committing to the risks involved. Mark and I immersed ourselves in the finalization of the save-the-date announcements, overseeing the printing and distribution of those elegant cards that captured us in a moment of unscripted laughter on our porch, the materials arriving with a satisfying heft that symbolized our determination to assert our narrative amid the lingering echoes of the party disruption, and while responses from friends poured in with enthusiastic affirmations and queries about attire, the familial channels remained fraught with my mother's daily check-ins laced with updates on Lauren's purported morning sickness and subtle entreaties for me to prioritize unity over lingering resentments. My father adopted a more detached stance in his communications, offering gruff encouragements about letting bygones be bygones in the manner of those classic Western films he favored, where feuds dissolved under the vast sky. But the undercurrent of favoritism toward Lauren's situation persisted, manifesting in casual mentions of her glowing updates that only amplified my internal resolve to navigate the situation with calculated restraint. Lauren's abrupt withdrawal from direct contact following our tense phone exchange should have provided a measure of relief, allowing space for the dust to settle after her provocative intrusion. Yet it instead cultivated an atmosphere of anticipatory unease akin to the calm before a thunderstorm gathers force over the flat Illinois landscape, a tension that Mark began to mirror in subtle ways during our shared routines, such as the evenings we spent curled on the couch absorbing episodes of true crime documentaries that served as his escapist indulgence, or the hurried morning coffees that evolved into perfunctory kisses before he departed for the construction site. One particular night, as we sifted through the incoming RSVPs scattered across the kitchen table like puzzle pieces of our future, he abruptly set aside the pile and regarded me with an intensity that cut through the domestic hum, confessing that the ongoing friction with Lauren was exerting a toll on our connection and revealing that she had reached out to him once more the previous day, her conversation dissolving into tears as she portrayed herself as the isolated victim of my deliberate exclusion. My utensil halted midway through a bite of the vegetable stir-fry I had hastily assembled from the refrigerator's sparse offerings, a surge of disbelief mingling with irritation at the revelation that she had circumvented me to appeal directly to Mark, prompting me to question the nature of their exchange and whether her appeals stemmed from genuine vulnerability or a strategic bid to erode the foundation of my support system. He dismissed it as mere emotional venting attributed to the hormonal fluctuations of early pregnancy, coupled with lingering hurt from what she described as the cutting undertone of my party toast, but the disclosure left a residue of doubt, causing me to wonder if she were methodically sowing discord to reclaim her central position even as our wedding plans advanced. Determined to confront the mounting pressures head-on, we attended a family barbecue that weekend in my parents' expansive backyard, where the grill billowed plumes of smoke carrying the rich scents of seared burgers and bratwurst alongside ears of corn wrapped in foil that hissed invitingly as my father wielded his tongs with practiced expertise, evoking the quintessential essence of Midwestern summer gatherings, complete with neighboring families drifting over bearing coolers of beverages and children darting about in pursuit of emerging fireflies as the sun descended toward the horizon in a blaze of orange hues. The event commenced with an outward appearance of conviviality, laughter mingling with the sizzle of meat and the pop of cans being opened, but the equilibrium teetered the instant Lauren made her entrance, her arm entwined with that of her intermittently reliable boyfriend Jake, her hand positioned protectively over her midsection in a gesture that accentuated the purported early signs of her pregnancy, her attire a flowing sundress that enhanced the image of burgeoning maternal radiance she projected so convincingly to the assembled relatives. My mother radiated delight, heaping portions onto Lauren's plate with maternal fervor, while my father interjected with light-hearted quips about preparing to dote on yet another grandchild with the same indulgent spirit he had shown toward previous family additions, though I noted Lauren's occasional glances in my direction, laden with a wariness that suggested she anticipated my response to the ongoing saga. As the group transitioned to relaxed positions in lawn chairs clustered around the fire pit where flames danced and crackled against the encroaching dusk, the dialogue inevitably circled back to comparisons between impending weddings and the allure of newborns, with Lauren commandeering the narrative by expounding on her aspirations for a destination ceremony once the baby arrived, envisioning exotic locales captured through the lens of social media for maximum appeal and engagement from her wide network. Jake offered supportive affirmations, though his demeanor betrayed flickers of ennui from enduring her theatrical tendencies in prior cycles of their relationship, the kind where he tolerated the turbulence primarily for the perks of shared social outings rather than any deep-seated passion. When she directed a query toward me regarding the aesthetic quality of our save-the-date cards with a smile that hinted at underlying challenge, as though positioning our efforts as a lesser spectacle, I countered with a composed smile of my own, assuring her that the design prioritized the essence of the couple without allowance for peripheral distractions and extending an invitation for her to anticipate receiving her copy, which might even offer inspiration for her own evolving arrangements in the near future. The surrounding attendees responded with chuckles, interpreting the exchange as playful familial teasing, but Lauren's complexion betrayed a flush of unease, prompting my mother to swiftly redirect attention toward the merits of the accompanying potato salad to preserve the fragile harmony. In the quieter interludes as twilight deepened and the fire's warmth warded off the cooling air, I maneuvered a private conversation with Jake under the guise of professional curiosity, since he operated within the real estate sector much like Lauren, and in the course of our discussion about market trends, he inadvertently disclosed a detail about her recent avoidance of substantive medical consultations, attributing it to bouts of exhaustion, but underscoring an undercurrent of anxiety related to maintaining her public persona. This revelation nourished a burgeoning suspicion that her pregnancy narrative might constitute more of an embellished performance than a verified reality, particularly when observed in light of her evasive responses to probing inquiries about obstetric details during the gathering, where she deflected with generalized assurances of positivity without specifics. Returning home later that night with Mark, the disquiet lingered like a persistent fog, leading me to remain awake long after he had retired, my device in hand as I revisited archived family photographs until settling on an image from our early 20s depicting a coastal vacation marred by Lauren's outburst of resentment that culminated in the accidental loss of my cherished necklace amid the surf, a sequence that reinforced the cyclical nature of her disruptions and compelled me to weigh the ethics of leveraging such insights against the potential for escalating the conflict further. In the stillness, Mark stirred in his slumber, murmuring fragments about prioritizing family loyalties, a subconscious echo that amplified my internal debate over whether to confide the accumulating clues or allow the uncertainty to fester unchecked. The save-the-date cards reached the family addresses midway through the following week, triggering an immediate cascade of reactions that culminated in a torrent of calls and messages. Though it was Lauren's incoming line that ultimately connected during my commute home from an extended office meeting, the downpour outside drumming against the windshield in sync with the intensifying rhythm of my pulse as her voice erupted in accusation over the hand-free system. She lambasted the content of the announcement as a malicious, underhanded strike that framed her personal revelation as an unwelcome intrusion upon my idyllic circumstances, declaring that our mother was incensed and that Jake viewed my actions as bordering on instability, all while the rain intensified into sheets that blurred the road ahead. Pulling to the roadside with hazard lights flashing, I absorbed her tirade with a steady breath, retorting that accusations of instability rang hollow from the architect of such orchestrated theatrics and directing her to examine the finer details of the card, which emphasized themes of uninterrupted progression and boundaries against opportunistic interjections. Her protests devolved into a chaotic blend of demands and supplications, but I interjected with a measured laugh that caught me off guard with its edge, suggesting she vent her frustrations freely since the unfolding drama represented merely the opening act of a larger sequence. The connection severed abruptly amid a peal of thunder, yet upon arriving home, Mark awaited in the kitchen with his laptop aglow, displaying a forwarded correspondence from Lauren that chronicled her grievances in exhaustive detail, concluding with an urgent appeal to him for intervention before my conduct irreparably damaged the familial fabric. His countenance reflected a storm of its own as he powered down the device, insisting that we address the matter immediately, a confrontation that loomed with the promise of exposing fractures I had only begun to navigate. The grainy security camera image that Mark thrust across the kitchen table captured me in the act with unflinching clarity, my profile partially obscured but recognizable enough to betray the impulsive decision I'd made during that ill-advised visit to Lauren's office, the timestamp glowing like an accusation while the bakery box dangled from my hand as irrefutable proof of my covert intrusion into her professional territory. His gaze locked onto mine with a potent mixture of hurt and weariness that pierced deeper than any of Lauren's calculated provocations ever could, the overhead light casting elongated shadows across the uneaten remnants of the Chinese takeout we'd ordered in anticipation of a relaxed evening, now abandoned and congealing on the cluttered surface as the persistent patter of rain against the windows underscored the deteriorating atmosphere between us. He articulated his dismay in a voice roughened by the hours he'd spent mulling over the forwarded email chain from Lauren, emphasizing how this descent into surveillance and fabrication marked a departure from the principled individual he believed me to be, and revealing that her threats extended to involving our mother or even authorities if the confrontations intensified, all while the attached scan of her doctor's note, provisional and inconclusive, hinted at the fragile foundation of her pregnancy claim that she wielded like a weapon to maintain her dominance. Admitting the full extent of my actions would necessitate acknowledging the tangled web I'd woven in pursuit of vindication, a path that, despite its disagreeable turns, had offered fleeting empowerment after years of acquiescence. Yet it also risked alienating the steadfast partner whose loyalty formed the bedrock of my envisioned future, compelling me to navigate the moment with a precarious balance of candor and deflection. Throughout the protracted discussion that stretched into the small hours, his arguments carried a firm undercurrent of frustration, rooted in the observation that our relationship was buckling under the strain of this inherited familial discord, with me countering by framing my responses as a long-overdue assertion against Lauren's habitual manipulations that had eroded my confidence since childhood, though by the time exhaustion claimed us, a tentative accord emerged wherein we agreed to suspend further escalations and redirect our focus toward nurturing our bond, perhaps culminating in an invitation for Lauren to join us for a neutral coffee session aimed at fostering dialogue, like rational adults, rather than perpetuating the cycle of retaliation. As morning broke with the rain subsiding into a misty drizzle that veiled the Chicago skyline during my drive to the office, reflections on the attic letter and Jake's offhand revelations about her medical evasions dominated my thoughts, transforming curiosity into a catalyst for action that prompted me to circle back to her workplace under the pretext of delivering a conciliatory gesture, only to find her absent on a brief errand, according to her assistant. Seizing the opportunity to leave my phone behind momentarily and return shortly thereafter to reclaim it while surreptitiously scanning her disorganized desk for any corroborating evidence. Amid the clutter of property listings and stained coffee mugs, a crumpled appointment summary from the clinic caught my eye, dated to the prior week and stating unequivocally that no pregnancy had been confirmed with recommendations for additional testing. A discovery that solidified my suspicions of her announcement as a premature and possibly fabricated ploy designed to eclipse my milestone, igniting a turbulent blend of righteous indignation and ethical qualms about exploiting such private information, even as it armed me with the means to dismantle her facade from within. The internal conflict raged unchecked during the workday, where client reports blurred on my screen as I grappled with the dilemma of disclosing the findings to market the risk of portraying myself as an invasive meddler or harnessing them to orchestrate a more sophisticated form of retribution that skirted direct confrontation while exposing her inconsistencies to those closest to her, a choice that audiences might critique for its moral ambiguity, yet stemmed from the exhaustion of repeatedly yielding the narrative to her whims over decades of shared history. Familial obligations compounded the pressure that weekend when my mother decreed a mandatory reconciliation dinner at their home, insisting on full attendance without allowances for avoidance, transforming their dining space into a stage of contrived domesticity with crisp linens draping the table and a golden roasted chicken taking center position amid sides of mashed potatoes and glazed carrots, the aromas evoking a facade of warmth that barely concealed the simmering resentments ready to boil over at the slightest provocation. Lauren materialized with an air of contrived poise, her midsection artificially enhanced by strategic layering to simulate progression in her condition, accompanied by Jake, whose sidelong glances toward me conveyed a mix of suspicion and discomfort. While our parents assumed roles as impartial mediators from the outset, my father dispensing glasses of red wine alongside platitudes drawn from his repertoire of old movies where kinfolk inevitably reconciled under duress. The initial exchanges proceeded with strained politeness, forks chiming against china as topics ranged from mundane updates on home repairs to Mark's latest project anecdotes. But Lauren shattered the veneer midway through by clattering her utensil emphatically and launching into a diatribe about how my save-the-date represented an overt assault that recast her joyful disclosure as a burdensome sidebar to my self-absorbed existence. My mother inclined her head in sympathetic alignment, but I leaned forward with deliberate composure, retorting that perceptions of burden paled in comparison to the audacity of commandeering an engagement celebration with an unverified revelation delivered through a smirk that reeked of triumph rather than sincerity. A statement that plunged the room into stunned quietude, with Jake fidgeting in his seat and my father emitting a throat-clearing cough to dissipate the tension. Undeterred, Lauren retaliated with performative tears glistening in her eyes, insisting on the authenticity of her news and attributing my skepticism to an ingrained envy of her capacity to infuse excitement into otherwise routine family proceedings, positioning herself once again as the vivacious counterpart to my perceived steadiness. Seizing the opening, I introduced the pivotal twist with the nonchalance of casual observation, suggesting that excitement warranted verification before broadcast and that perhaps consulting reliable sources would prevent future missteps in timing or substance, her pallor draining as her gaze flicked toward Jake in evident alarm while my mother pressed for elaboration, only for me to deflect with a dismissive gesture that permitted the insinuation to take root organically among the listeners. The gathering unraveled into abrupt farewells laced with unresolved barbs, but en route home, Mark turned to me with furrowed brows, probing the intent behind my cryptic remark and acknowledging that I harbored undisclosed knowledge. A query I met with hesitation as the pilfered photograph weighed heavily in my pocket like contraband. The conversation interrupted by an anonymous text materializing on my screen warning me to cease meddling in Lauren's affairs, lest my wedding arrangements face similar sabotage, its origin ambiguous enough to evoke paranoia about alliances forming against me in the shadows. In a bid to exact a measure of witty reprisal without overt fingerprints, I anonymously disseminated invitations for a mock baby shower via an online event platform targeted at Lauren's social and professional circles, fabricating details of an elaborate surprise gathering in a public park complete with a registry boasting extravagantly impractical items, such as jewel-encrusted baby accessories that bordered on the absurd. A ploy designed to humiliate through excess while maintaining plausible deniability on my part. The scheme circulated by Monday, eliciting a flurry of perplexed responses across her feeds from colleagues and acquaintances querying the authenticity amid her hasty posts disavowing the event as malicious mischief. Her composed exterior fracturing visibly in the digital realm as confusion rippled through her network and eroded the mystique she cultivated so meticulously. A sense of gratifying equilibrium washed over me in the moment, tempered by the awareness of how such maneuvers mirrored the very pettiness I decried in her, yet as I entered the house that evening laden with grocery bags from a routine market run, Mark sat rigidly at the table engrossed in his phone. His features etched with pallor upon revealing an email from Lauren headlined with implications about my character and stability. He detailed her assertions that I had violated her privacy through unauthorized access, corroborated by the security footage now circulating among select contacts, and questioned aloud what depths I had plumbed in this escalating vendetta, the inquiry hanging in the air like a precipice from which our shared path teetered perilously close to collapse. That damning security still from Lauren's office loomed large in the tense standoff at our kitchen table, its pixelated evidence of my furtive presence frozen in time while Mark's expression blended raw disappointment with the kind of bone-deep fatigue that arises from watching a loved one's principles erode under the pressure of unresolved grievances. The dim glow from the fixture above highlighting the cooling containers of takeout that now symbolized the stalled normalcy we'd hoped to reclaim after the day's burdens. He leaned forward with the printed pages of her accusatory email spread out like exhibits in a personal trial, detailing how my foray into deception and anonymous provocations deviated sharply from the grounded woman he'd fallen for amid the chaos of our individual pasts, and underscoring that her warnings about escalating to family elders or law enforcement carried real weight given the vulnerabilities exposed in the attached medical summary, which tentatively refuted her pregnancy claim and painted her entire announcement as a precarious bid for centrality that I had now weaponized with ruthless precision. Confessing the entirety of my discoveries would demand owning the invasive tactics I'd employed in the name of justice after years of her encroachments, a trajectory that, for all its questionable morality, had delivered a rush of agency in reclaiming what she'd stolen time and again, yet it threatened to fracture the trust anchoring our partnership, forcing me to tread a fine line between vulnerability and strategic omission as the rain outside tapered into sporadic drips against the glass. Our dialogue extended deep into the night, with Mark articulating how the pervasive family strife was corroding the foundation of our impending union. His points laced with frustration over the way it mirrored the relational pitfalls he'd observed in his own kin during heated gatherings. While I defended my course as an essential reckoning against Lauren's ingrained habit of subversion that had diminished my voice since our shared girlhood in the suburbs, though as weariness overtook us, a provisional understanding took shape wherein we pledged to halt the cycle of reprisals and realign our energies toward mutual support, potentially extending an olive branch through a low-key meeting that prioritized empathy over accusation in the spirit of mature resolution. Dawn arrived with the drizzle lifting into a hazy veil that softened the urban sprawl visible from my office window during the commute, but preoccupation with the letters, confessions, and Jake's inadvertent disclosures about her health reticence overshadowed the workday, evolving idle speculation into a resolve to verify the inconsistencies through discreet channels that ultimately led me to revisit her workspace, feigning reconciliation with a token of pastries, only to exploit a brief window of her absence for a deeper probe that unearthed the confirmatory clinic report, negating any fetal confirmation and urging prompt reevaluation. A find that crystallized her revelation as likely a fabricated escalation timed to overshadow my joy and fueled my conflicted determination to deploy it not through blunt confrontation, but via layered exposures that would unravel her construct organically. The moral quandary intensified amid professional distractions where spreadsheets dissolved into irrelevance as I debated revealing the intelligence to Mark at the peril of cementing my image as a boundary-crossing antagonist or channeling it into a nuanced counteroffensive that highlighted her deceptions to our inner circle without implicating myself directly, a decision that observers might decry for its ethical gray areas yet arose from the depletion of perpetually conceding narrative control to her flair for drama across our intertwined histories. Compounding the strain, my mother summoned an obligatory summit dinner at their residence that weekend, mandating participation to mend the widening rifts, converting the familiar dining area into a tableau of feigned domestic bliss, with starched napkins framing a succulent roast chicken surrounded by buttery vegetables and herb-infused potatoes, the inviting fragrances clashing with the latent hostilities poised to erupt beneath the surface. Lauren entered with affected serenity, her silhouette augmented by subtle padding to feign advancement in her supposed gestation, shadowed by Jake, whose wary appraisals in my direction hinted at brewing suspicions. As our parents orchestrated the proceedings like neutral arbitrators, my father circulating wine pours interspersed with homespun wisdom from his vintage film collection, where blood ties triumphed over discord through inevitable forgiveness. Superficial pleasantries governed the early exchanges, silverware tinkling amid recaps of trivial updates like plumbing woes or Mark's on-site escapades. But Lauren disrupted the equilibrium by dropping her cutlery with deliberate force and unleashing a monologue decrying my announcement as a calculated affront that relegated her uplifting disclosure to an inconvenient footnote in my narrative of entitlement. My mother nodded in partial accord, yet I advanced with calculated poise, countering that notions of inconvenience paled against the brazenness of infiltrating an engagement festivity with a speculative proclamation laced with smug satisfaction that smacked of conquest over collaboration. A riposte that cast the assembly into hushed astonishment, with Jake squirming visibly and my father attempting to intervene with a resonant cough to ease the strain. Pressing her advantage, Lauren summoned manufactured tears to her lashes, affirming the legitimacy of her condition and chalking up my doubts to a deep-seated resentment of her innate ability to inject vitality into the family's otherwise predictable rhythms, recasting herself as the dynamic foil to my steadiness in a bid to garner sympathy anew. Capitalizing on the vulnerability, I unveiled the crucial inflection with offhand detachment, proposing that true vitality demanded substantiation prior to public fanfare and that consulting credible authorities might avert recurrences of such untimely or unsubstantiated spectacles, her visage blanching as her eyes started to Jake in palpable distress, while my mother solicited clarifications, only for me to parry with a casual wave that sowed the germ of skepticism to germinate without further prodding. The assembly fragmented into strained partings infused with lingering acrimony, but during the drive away, Mark pivoted toward me with creased forehead, interrogating the subtext of my enigmatic comment and conceding that I concealed pivotal insights. A probe I encountered with pause as the illicit image seared in my pocket like forbidden knowledge, the exchange halted by a text from an unidentified source cautioning against further interference in Lauren's domain under threat of reciprocal disruption to my matrimonial prospects, its sender elusive enough to kindle fears of covert coalitions arrayed in opposition. To administer a dose of shrewd retaliation absent traceable origins, I circulated fictitious baby shower summonses through a digital invitation service aimed at Lauren's acquaintances and business associates, contriving particulars of an ostentatious ambush in a communal green space replete with a wish list of ludicrously opulent necessities like gem-adorned infant paraphernalia verging on caricature, an artifice crafted to mortify via extravagance while preserving my anonymity in the fallout. The contrivance proliferated by midweek, spawning a deluge of baffled acknowledgments across her online presence from peers and contacts probing the veracity amid her desperate rebuttals, branding it as spiteful fabrication. Her polished veneer splintering in the virtual sphere as bewilderment cascaded through her connections and chipped away at the allure she nurtured with such care. Elation at restoring some equilibrium surged briefly, moderated by recognition of how these maneuvers echoed the triviality I condemned in her arsenal, but upon crossing the threshold that night burdened with provisions from the corner store, Mark perched tautly at the counter absorbed in his device, his pallid features disclosing an incoming dispatch from Lauren titled with insinuations about my reliability and composure. He outlined her charges of privacy infringement via illicit entry, buttressed by the disseminated surveillance capture now shared among confidants, and voiced bewilderment at the extremes I'd traversed in this vendetta, the question suspending like a chasm over which our joint trajectory dangled on the brink of rupture. The evening's pinnacle of discord materialized with the insistent ring of my phone as Mark retreated to the garage seeking respite, Lauren's identifier illuminating the display and compelling me to respond in anticipation of the outburst I'd have foreseen since the announcement's dispersal. Her initial epithet slicing through the line before dissolving into heaving sobs that conveyed desperation more than wrath. She railed against the sham gathering and the intrusion as orchestrated assaults, crediting Jake with spotting the recording and noting the murmurs now questioning her pregnancy's authenticity. With our mother having contacted the physician to affirm the absence of verification, culminating in declarations that I had demolished her standing irretrievably. Permitting her to unburden the torrent, I traversed the kitchen with deliberate steps, interspersing allusions to our common history skeletons to sharpen the sting, remarking that demolition paled beside her endeavors to undermine my betrothal through a rehearsed disclosure and recalling the unsent missive where she avowed her animosity toward my attainments as motivation for interference, framing this as retribution aligning with cosmic balance in our sibling ledger. Her discourse crumbled into abject hysteria, blending indictments of my dullness against her vibrancy with admissions that the impending child, genuine or contrived, offered escape from obscurity, but I maintained equanimity, unveiling the crowning stratagem by noting that our save-the-date transcended mere stationery to encompass a networked variant disseminated within familial networks, a interactive chronicle commencing with nostalgic vignettes of youth and festivities before segueing to the gala footage overlaid with her interjection, then transitioning to an obscured rendition of the letter captioned to evoke illumination over illusion, a narrative so adroitly veiled as retrospective homage that it proliferated unchecked among relatives and kin, eliciting inquiries into her veracity sans my explicit involvement. Directing her to her alerts, I registered her inhalation as realization dawned, the digital trail amplifying her isolation without crude denunciation. The line terminated amid her entreaties for retraction and vows to recant the announcement as hasty exuberance, but I disconnected with the aftertaste of triumph turning acrid as Mark re-entered, posture rigid, inquiring about the interlocutor and the chronicle in question, prompting me to demonstrate the construct in hopes of alliance only to encounter his stern appraisal. He conceded the ingenuity while decrying its cruelty, pondering the ramifications should the conception prove viable or if it sundered our lineage beyond repair, igniting a nocturnal dispute that compelled me to reckon with the possibility of morphing into the adversary I sought to vanquish. His queries piercing the veil of ambiguity, encircling whether I'd liberated myself or merely perpetuated the toxicity. By first light, Lauren dispatched a capitulation via message, committing to transparency at a collective assembly, yet Mark's detachment endured, assembling an overnight case for his siblings' abode to deliberate. In solitude, his parting forehead brush accompanied by a weary exhale that left me solitary in the hollowed space, contemplating if the pursuit of equity had fortified or fissured my essence irreparably. In the subsequent days, equilibrium restored itself tentatively, with Lauren's publicity withdrawn as premature zeal. Her profiles falling mute while my mother telephoned with qualified gratitude for unmasking the fabrication alongside apprehensions about enduring wounds, and Mark reintegrated after 7 days of reflection, extending pardon tempered by caution as our nuptials proceeded under a pall of reservations. Contemplating the band on my finger in idle moments, I muse over the merit of such luminescence against its scorching cost, speculating if Lauren's forthcoming ploy simmers unvoiced or if we'll transcend the loop. Certain enigmas persisting like lingering haze post-conflagration, did fruition ever manifest beyond pretense, or remained it vapor? Will Mark's faith coalesce wholly, or did I pilfer my narrative's felicity? The chronicle concludes unresolved, reverberating to invite discernment on triumph versus transference.